Well, in that case, let's get going. Hi, everybody. I haven't had a chance to introduce myself yet, so I'll do that just now. I'm Attila Farkas. I'm director with Canada Health Infoway for the Standards Collaborative. Should I turn this on?
Yeah.
There you go. Oh my goodness.
There we go. It's better.
Perfect. So, when Andy sent us an email about a week ago, 2 weeks ago?
Well, 3 weeks.
3 weeks?
3
Oh my
weeks.
God, time
We
flies.
responded a week later.
Exactly. So we were wondering what this meeting was all about. Andy in Hamilton talking at the college is this his thing or is this HR someone? It was not very clear. And then we started exchanging some emails, and the opportunity clearly showed itself to come in and talk to people that are active in the domain. We weren't entirely sure what the composition of the group would be. So I spoke with Greg and I thought, we're doing so much change in the Standards Collaborative that it may be worthwhile coming in and doing a presentation on that, and then another side of it, which is also an Infoway feature, the EMRI team, CSI. I like CSI more. You guys should stick with that one. So then, here we are. We came in this morning and I see a room full of students, which is very cool because you guys are the ones who are going to have to carry this torch forward. And I'll try to do a presentation in which you get to see the bigger picture. Every time I go to HL7 International, I go to about 2-3 meetings every year. I see all our friends like Andy sitting in meeting rooms discussing very feverishly and very hot debates on data types. And as glamorous as that may sound for them, when I tell about that to my executive vice president, he says, "What? I don't understand how that will help us with our investment project." So I'm saying that because I want to make a note very clear from the very get-go. It is a very popular belief out there that interoperability is not a technological problem. Technically speaking, you can resolve anything with software engineering, and it's just a consensus building game. It's the hardest thing you've ever seen though. Just think about trying to convince your parents that you need a bigger allowance. You'll have to lobby really hard for that. And in order for that to work, you have to build up some structures. You have to build up some roots in the community where people that come to the table to talk to you see predictability, see future, see some thought in what you're talking about. So I thought that it would be a good segue into Greg's presentation, which will be technical for the engineering students, to give you a sense as to how standards are being executed, especially healthcare IT standards in Canada. So you probably heard about Canada Health Infoway. Some are working on projects. And so I thought that the purpose of this presentation would work well if we focused a little bit on how we are organized, what is our vision behind this particular branch of our health IT standards, which is the HL7 V3 in particular, to look for potential integration points and impact of all this for our near future, and then invite for a dialogue. So what better way to start by showing you the complexity that has been designed into the Pan-Canadian healthcare governance structure. Standards Council of Canada is the topmost federally funded institution in Canada that's responsible for anything standards. A very small portion of their work activity is geared towards healthcare agenda, and a couple of years ago, 7-8 years ago to be precise, they decided that they just don't have the exact focus and details of working out all the Pan-Canadian standards that are needed to support a healthcare agenda. And since Infoway is a not-for-profit organization funded from the federal government, they thought that it would be a very good idea to create Infoway, to make Infoway the custodian of these health IT standards. So they created the so-called Standards Collaborative. So what you see on this picture is The Standards Collaborative, in fact, is the green box all the way down below. It is made up of a group of people working for Infoway. The team is less than 20. Used to be bigger. These days is relatively small. And the idea there was that operating under the umbrella of Canada Health Infoway, there could be funding channeled towards supporting the investment projects that Canada Health Infoway was making into the jurisdictional partners to develop the health infrastructure that was captured in the blueprint. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the blueprint, but there was such a thing created that explains how logically information should be grouped, where it should go, and what's the philosophy of information exchange in Canada. So then what they did, they said, okay, so in order for this to work, we will have to look at what kind of standards do we need, what kind of standards exist internationally, and then do we need to specialize these. So they created the so-called Standards Collaborative Strategic Committee, SCSC. That was the committee that was supposed to figure out the strategy and how should we go about building all this. Then they had a coordinating committee that was responsible for carrying out the orders from its superiors, and it had two side committees, a clinical subcommittee and a technical subcommittee, which the names clearly imply what they are supposed to do. And then, because there's a whole slew of vendors, jurisdictional players, and public at large or other interest groups, the thought was that it would really serve us well if we created the so-called working groups. And then we created 9 working groups originally, the 10th having been added about a year and a half ago. So those 10 working groups operate on the principle that people meet regularly, usually twice a month, or depending on how active they are, sometimes they have more frequent meetings. And it is these groups that are geared towards the verticals within the Canadian blueprint that will be discussing the problems more stringent in that particular space, in that domain. And then those discussions are expected to drive the standards that are behind those activities in the Standards Collaborative. So in effect, the Standards Collaborative becomes the custodian of the pan-Canadian healthcare standards and tries to line them up. Now that was the story before. They worked at it 6-7 years, and we arrived at a huge amount of standards that were distributed as a huge zip package. Justin knows all too well, because whenever you guys work on something, you have to download those big zip files and then try to work your way through them. It's a nightmare for implementers. Both Greg and I are coming from the vendor space, and so we know what real software engineering is like and what challenges you have when you are faced with it. So I joined Infoway about less than 2 years ago, and the reason for that was that they wanted to add a more hands-on approach to standards development in Canada, or at least distribution. And so one of my first tasks was that I had to look at how do I make Standards Collaborative become a little bit more focused on the reality of the market. So I came up with this concept diagram at the time, which shows pretty much the life cycle of what should happen in order for this to work. The reality of the fact is that that cloud on the top right side is all the market players, or not all of them, but symbolizes all the market players that can influence and do influence the standards agenda. That can be international organizations that we play in, because what happens internationally usually sets the tone for vendors to create products in those spaces. And then we have the Canadian market through the SWIGs, JIGs, we have our committees, and we have our interest groups and investments, right? So the idea was that if you consider all these as source of change, you funnel them into request for change systems that are in context, then you can create standards roadmaps that are going to focus you in the direction in which you want to go. And then you assign those to the services that exist in the Standards Collaborative. Currently we have terminology messaging tooling on this page, but it was just for illustration only. Obviously we have other for education and whatnot. Then the idea was that these service teams could generate the artifacts that would be version controlled and then distribute it through some electronic means. HR7 International is not so much different from this, only they are looking at their standards from, if I may say so, from an academic standpoint, as in trying to make it as versatile as possible, which adds obviously a lot of complexity, because the more Swiss knifey you want to create something, the more complex it is to engineer it. So this concept domain then has been applied to a proposed architecture. And what you see here, I'm not going to get into too much detail, but the idea is that this would be the Standards Collaborative, and what you see on the back side of this slide is the firewall that would basically shield internal activities from external activities. We have two ways of interacting with the outside through our horizontal website, and then the right side, internal collaboration, where our partners could come in and then we would drive to collaboration services, the whole agenda of the RFCs, SDO strategies would come in there, and then every planning would drive the implementation services on the left. Repository would obviously capture all this, and then through production services publish it. Now, what this shows you is that we're actively changing the focus of the Standards Collaborative from being a publishing house like ISO is, of the standards, and then you're on your own and read it, do whatever you want with it, to providing you with more of a product-focused approach. As in, when you go to the Apple site and you bought some hardware from them, you have the reliability of their service, in that you are going to be able to download all your applications from there, all your upgrades. Everything is in context of the work that you're doing. What we're trying to change here is not to show the market the standard, but instead to say, if you are a vendor or a jurisdiction that needs help with the drug domain space, for example, then come to our website, because you will find information tailored for everything that you need in a drug space. And that's going to be the standard, that's going to be the tools, that's going to be your implementation guides, and even potentially testing platform. Our colleagues from CSI, which is a nice term for clinical systems integration, are the guys who are working on the front line of talking to end users, implementers, jurisdictions that make use of this. So they see what the market really needs, and they are the ones banging their head against the wall when changes are necessary. So what I'm trying to do is to create the climate for this change to go a lot easier. So whatever we put out should be something that they can immediately pick up and help the jurisdiction and implementers with it, and then anything that they learn could feed into this very quickly, so that we have a very fast turnaround time. So then, that was last year in April. This year, what you see on this picture is the actual state. Everything that has a color on it is a system that's either been implemented or is being implemented. The standards distribution, the wiki, as you've probably seen it already, it's called Info Central now. It's been rebranded. And it is a joint launch platform for both EMR and for SC to distribute anything that we do in standards. And it's not only HR7, but since this discussion is hosted by HR7, it's worth keeping the focus on it. We also have terminology services there. We just launched yesterday the Info Desk, the Vision Flow. That is a productivity enabler tool for people that have questions. They can come in and get them in contact. And then through our membership services, we're hoping to be able to create an integrated environment where you have a one-stop shop solution. You come in there and then you do not have to worry about how these things are packaged. This is pretty much internal stuff. So then let's focus on the HR7 component for sake of argument. The messaging services team is the one that takes care of the HR7, and the way it is being done, for those that have been exposed to it, they know that from a macro perspective, Canada has launched two HR7 standards, the CREX series and the MR series. The CREX is a good couple of years old, and it was mainly done for labs, I think. For drugs. There. So it was done for them, and they were early implementers when even the HR7 standard was a little bit younger. It got a lot of adoption, but it was hard to migrate towards new structures. So what happened in 2007, there was another release called the MR series, and the MR series was supposed to bring it into the new age. The MR series fell short of expectations in a couple of areas, and so it was followed up quickly by an MR 2009 series, which was supposed to fix a lot of the inconsistencies. Nevertheless, this is the typical HR7 development pipeline as it was decomposed by one of our architects. It is showing the V3 generator at its heart. As you guys probably have seen, there's a lot of volunteer-based tooling in the public domain that the international community, quite frankly, is forced to use because they have nothing better. It's a very complex model to put it through its paces, and because of that, you can imagine that if you have something available, you'll try to use it and then hope that it doesn't break. For those that have done professional software engineering, they know the importance of using quality control and version control tooling for any product that you're developing. When I first saw this, and I don't mean to take away from the value that the V3 generator carries, there's obviously a lot of very good work that went into it. Nevertheless, it freaked the hell out of me. I used to develop processes, software for the US market, which is FDA regulated, and the regulation clearly states that not only the software has to be version controlled and quality controlled, but you have to have a very clear inventory of tools you have used, and that inventory of tools has to prove where it's coming from. In case you build anything in your software, it has to show that it is of known provenance, and it's not just something that you picked up a free IP and then you included it because it's convenient. You cannot do that. And so we were used to a very high level of, high detail of rigor when building our applications. And when I noticed that the V3 generator is basically sitting on a public site and anybody at any time can download it, and then if something breaks in it, Lloyd usually or somebody else who knows how it works, jumps in and quickly makes the fix, that in my mind was just mind-boggling, as in how can I generate pan-Canadian standards with a tool that might change next week? I will never ever be able to go back to my baseline and try to move it along from there because things have changed, right? So on top of that, the other problem with this model is that it is extremely manual. The models which are expected to evolve from something that you see in the top left corner called the STF XLS. It's a huge Excel spreadsheet that it's our tracking framework. It tracks all the changes and all the requests that users are making to the model. And then that, using Visio, then gets modified to reflect, to model that request. That is put through the system. And in the end, you arrive at these artifacts which make up the Pan-Canadian standard. And it's thousands and thousands of files, making it very expensive and very long to do a Pan-Canadian release, which is one of the reasons why Pan-Canadian releases have not occurred more frequently than 2 years. Just as a side note, you're talking about costing the vicinity of $1 million to put out a release like this. So as you can see, there's a serious cost implication as well as impact to the community. So what is the solution? Well, the solution came to me as I was starting to talk to our colleagues, and I noticed that when they're working with the end users, the jurisdictions in this particular case, they noticed that the jurisdictions pick up the Pan-Canadian standard, and every jurisdiction does it differently, how they interpret it and how they look at it, but then ultimately what they do is something that Andy mentioned. They say, okay, well, this is too broad for me. I do not need this flexibility, what I would like to do is to constrain it to a particular value range or a particular implementation style. So they created the application called Remixer, which was in fact loading up the standard, the programmatic, well, the binary version of the standard, and then allowing a really nice user interface to just go into a particular transaction, into a particular message and say, okay, well, this can be constrained to do this. And while that's very cool, the problem with it is that different jurisdictions do it differently, inherently creating divergence, and so a standard becomes an oxymoron. It's no longer a standard, it's just a development platform for a standard. And so that's why you do not have interoperability. It's not V3's shortfall, it's not process shortfall, it's basically people trying to achieve their goals and doing anything that they can to get there. So then we were also thinking, okay, so one of the end users that could really, really benefit from proper standards development are the vendor community. The vendor community who do the applications, who have to build for very clear use cases. So let's assume for a second that we managed to find consensus in a room. How would you then bridge the technical gap? And so we had some brainstorming sessions with the CSI guys, and we came to the conclusion that, well, we should distribute the standard in a binary format. And the binary format should be something that we can then analyze for change. And we can assess the impact of any change that I'm planning on doing as to whether or not it breaks backwards compatibility. Then you have options. Arguably, you wouldn't want to change an interface, but if you have no other way of implementing this thing, then you could create another interface and not break the old one. So you have choices. So in order to start bridging this gap, we thought, you know what, why don't we make an investment in Remixer and start building it up with all the features necessary to take this loaded model and expose it to the end users in such a way that they could actually change the model within the constraining tool. And by doing this, you're not looking at Remixer as being a constraining tool anymore, but it becomes basically a modeling and development tool. The output of which then could be thrown into a bunch of plugins. And so you could constantly create an arsenal of tools that you're going to be able to plug into these things and start doing value-added services. As in, the jurisdiction wants to see what is the change between two particular releases. They could just load up the myths from the two releases and apply a compare function on them and then see what that changes. Or if they were thinking about creating a new interaction or specializing an interaction, they could immediately see what change that triggers throughout the models, because, for example, CMATs are the ones that are shared. If you're changing a CMAT, you're not just changing the one that you're using, you're changing everywhere. But the advantage of using a single cockpit tool is that all the model is loaded. If you make a change one place, everywhere, it's applied everywhere. So you can immediately see the ripple effect of what you did. And that is a significant departure from the current state, where if you change a Visio, you change one Visio. Now you have to remember to go change everyone, and then you may still have conflicts at the end. So the direction in which we're marching is Remixer being enhanced with every feature that we can put in. Of course, this is development at a cost, therefore we're limited by our budgets, but what we're trying to do is to put in significantly sufficient features to allow for slowly getting towards a place where we can model pretty much all of our transactions that are necessary. The intent not being to recreate enterprise architecture. You cannot possibly fund something like that, but to inch ever closer. Greg has some awesome screenshots that will give you some sense as to how this works. And then the idea being that, if you remember the operating model there with the membership being part of the community, to have all this tooling available online in a not so distant future, so that premium members can come in, can load up the Pan-Canadian standard release that they require, go into their public private space and use Remixer or message builder type tools and pretty much do a self-serve, so that in the immediate future I can start changing my Pan-Canadian standards release from thousands of files in a zip file to only the core components that carry all the model information. So the hope is that the future Pan-Canadian standard will no longer be anything else but a collection of myths and implementation guides. Because through those you can generate the business artifacts, the technical views, whatever you want. And then I would rather invest in creating these plugins that you see on the right side that people can download whatever they need. If you want to see an interaction diagram for a particular model, you should be able to just say, I want that for this particular model. Or if you want APIs, then that's what you get. Or if you want implementation guides, that's what you get. For the summer, and I'm going to talk a little bit later about that, maybe I should focus on this for a second. What you see here is the diagram of how change is currently being executed on within these SC working groups that I showed you that there were 10 of. So when items were added, and you see a prioritization box right there in the middle, that's a new one that I added, but currently, as in right now, the way the SWIGs operate is when items are being brought to their attention for discussion, as in a jurisdiction has a problem and needs it fixed, they discuss it in the working group meeting and then they come to a consensus. Now when that consensus is reached, it's nothing more than a verbal agreement on the requirements of the change. And that those requirements are entered in that STF spreadsheet that you noticed in a previous slide. And that's where the work stops. The work stops at requirements consensus, and then it is months later when a release is planned to be executed that that requirement is now picked up and implemented. You can imagine if there are early adopters, and there are some jurisdictions that have money and eagerness to proceed, if they were to pick up those requirements and go ahead and implement it themselves, when the Standards Collaborative gets around to implementing these things in the Pan-Canadian standard, it's almost guaranteed divergence. I mean, two people will not edit the models the same way with the same requirements. So what we're doing is, if we implement the infrastructure for Remixer and we make it available, then working groups will be able to do not just consensus building towards requirements, but following a prioritization activity, they can go straight to development and develop the models within those working groups, arriving to a quality complete state, at which point we can take over and start version controlling that change. With that, we can reduce the Pan-Canadian standards release cycle to 24 hours pretty much. Everything's always available online. What I need to do is to properly communicate the heartbeats, to do the build of these things overnight and have the quality control built in. Now that would allow tremendous support for early implementers or projects that are proceeding out there. Because if a vendor comes to the table and they need to resolve something and they just cannot, and they articulate it clearly, then that change can be applied right away and a hotfix put out that's going to make it into the next release. So we're hoping that providing this agility into the standards implementation cycle will attract the community, the necessary players in the community to start taking note of it and realize that they're going to save money. Because rework is very expensive, and without supporting structures, that rework is basically guaranteed. So what does this mean for us? We are planning on having two standard, HL7 release for CRAX and the MR series later on this fall. And there hasn't been one since 2009. Actually, it's 2010 technically, but the name was implying 2009. Beside the point. The point is that what we're trying to do here is this summer we're going to implement all the changes that have been requested, and there's a lot of them coming, almost 250. They will be implemented using the manual structures that we're so used to, including the V3 generator, and then the outputs will be compared to a re-implementation of the same very changes using Remixer. Then Remixer, because it is loading the model completely, is inherently doing quality control, and we'll see if we need to extend that to some degree. And then we would like to compare the output of the two systems and interpret everything in context. As in, I'm not so much interested in seeing, style change, as I am interested to see that there's no content missing and there's nothing broken. And then if that is successful, then the go forward tool for SC development of HR7 will be the remixer package, and it will be in the context of that life cycle that you have seen in the opening slide. And from that point on, we're no longer going to use the V3 generator and the pipelines, and that hopefully will hold some quality control promise for the entire Pan-Canadian user base. So this was it. I hope it was giving you guys a little bit of a sense of an overview of what standards are within the SC. And then Greg will be able to talk about the hands-on challenges with this. I'll stop here for a second in case you have questions.
Attila, when you go away from the V3 generator, are you still using the MIF as your basis? Okay.
Yeah.
So you're generating schema from the MIF?
Yes.
So you're going to implement your own...
Our release will be the MIF itself.
So you're not going to release XSD files?
No. That was never really recommended by even HR7 International. I know that Paul was, in some cases, very explicit about not using the XSDs directly. Which doesn't mean that vendors cannot use them, but we would be hoping that that it will be recognized. You see, from my perspective as a standards collaborative not owner necessarily, but sorry, custodian of the message implementation, makes sense to release something that's core, that can be further specialized. It is the CSI team that can help the market with this specialization to be applied to whatever they need. And our hope was that if vendors realize the advantage of using binary format, as in interfaces themselves, APIs, in their product, then they wouldn't even have to know the details of how the standard works. All they need to understand is what interfaces are available. So for me as a CIO of a pharma company, what I need to know is that there's 56 messages in the Pan-Canadian space for doing drugs, and that these messages are described at the business level and technical artifact level with a downloadable component. That's all I need to know. Then I can tell my team, go download the specs, put it in your usage manuals or describe your use cases, and then get the implementation, the interface, the binary itself, build it into your product and try to go to a connectathon and try to connect. So that's how we need to approach this, because there's so many levels that collaborate in this space that unless you go too down and too technical, you will never succeed to find consensus between these guys.
Yeah, I think that we've always recommended unit-based approaches as well. But I do know that the projects I'm working on rely heavily on the schema in addition to, as we're doing transformation. So what I mean, working in the Alberta Ohio, we're transforming to V3, V2, and all the different formats all the time. And having new releases that didn't have the associated schema that was auto-generated from the MIF, so you knew they were consistent with the MIF, would be a real, cause a challenging change in how we're working today.
Okay. Right, and remember what I was showing there, the plugins? So the plugins are what should show what the market needs. If the market expresses a desire that they absolutely need XSDs, then we can create an XSD converter that is basically one and one only. And then anybody who uses transforms from the MIFs will at least have the guarantee that they're using the same schema, right?
Well, you need to use again, because the jurisdiction's localized constraint for the local environment, you need to use your own localized schema.
Right. But
Right.
Remixer does that for you, right? So, in a not so distant future, the idea is that we will create these member sites where tools are available within the sites. So jurisdictions, for example, trying to localize something for their needs would load the pan-Canadian standard baseline, whichever they want, whatever they need, or they're using. Then they say, okay, I'll import this in my personal space, and now I make my changes. While doing that, you are regenerating those same MIFs for your particular space. So then you apply the plugin over them, and you generate whatever you want. You generate the view for it, you generate your XSDs, right?
Yeah. Well, one of the biggest challenges with the XSDs is they don't actually contain the entire standard knowledge.
No, without doubt.
Yeah, so they're missing vocabulary, core elements that we're actually going to be starting performance testing on
Yeah.
and for certification. So if a HILE comes in for certification that isn't able to handle vocabulary changes, it won't see certification from Infoway.
Oh, without
Right.
doubt. And
So
there's lots of things that you have to enforce in code that you can't go anywhere near a schema, but they're still actually useful in the runtime process.
Yeah, if you, like, we've integrated Message Builder into Mule. We've integrated it and used it in a bunch of different service buses, and we've had no issue using it at runtime, and it does significantly more validation than any of the tooling out there that can provide with a basic XSD.
I mean, certain tools, certain tools, like for example, from my experience, BizTalk, you can't even receive a message if you don't have a schema for it, right? It requires a schema to know how to select values by XPath or to be able to map in other formats. I don't think like the validation can be left to more advanced tools like Message Builder. But I mean, just from getting it up and running, I mean, some tools require an XSD to. I know the BizTalk mapper won't even work if you don't have some sort of XSD that just describes this is what this looks like.
And the transition from something like, say, JCAPS, which is being used in Alberta, to a more modern platform is going to take us something like 2 to 5 years.
Right.
I used to be the architect in Canada for JCAP, so I know a lot about that platform. And the tooling that we actually have in play is actually inspired from the lackings of JCAPS.
Yes.
And I can honestly publicly say that is now a defunct product. We tried to use the XSDs, the schemas, in many projects and failed miserably in that platform. The marshalling and unmarshalling, it doesn't know the schema. The schema says you have to have everything there. So you end up with these giant objects of emptiness. And developers look at it and go, okay, I'm going to map from here to there, but it's great that you can see the structure and the shell. But you have to have a highly knowledgeable person doing that mapping.
Okay. And that's something we do on a day-to-day basis, and that's still based on the net. But our development environment in terms of the actual runtime is dependent on schema.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And Lauren, I would really appreciate if you could send me offline, of course, some information about what are the exact particulars of how an Alberta implementation project works, for example. Because we would like to make sure that whatever we're putting out does not in fact hinder those developers, but
Yeah.
helps them.
And it'll depend upon which piece of the jurisdictional organization you speak with, right? Because there's implementation teams implementing, say, client registry, which will use the tools differently than implementations teams implementing the HILE, which goes in messages in between client
Right.
registry and payment, right?
So we have to
Yeah.
find the right balance between, because let's face it, a lot of that is historical.
It is.
As
but
in,
it's a-
they had, right, at different points in time, they had to resolve different problems with whatever they had available, and so they came up with their own thing. But if we are properly articulating that going forward, we can give you support, then people can be transitioned over to newer, better ways of doing
Yes.
stuff. And then once that transition is over, then it will be significantly faster and more robust, right?
Yes, but transition plans for projects of that scale are in the 2 to 5 years.
Right. Right. I mean, to build this out is non-trivial either. So.
Yeah.
I have a non-related question for Brains.
Okay, I'm done.
That's okay. So I assume that the goal here, because now you're going to be kind of diverging from the way the universal standards are published, would the goal be in the future to bring this to HL7 as a way that they could do standards publishing? And the second part of that question would be, how would the tool, like what's the licensing of the tool? Would it facilitate something like that? Could like another jurisdiction like the Netherlands take Remixer, or for example, the UK, some other jurisdiction take Remixer and use it on their own to develop their own standards? Would that be something you're looking for?
I expected that somebody was going to ask this difficult question. And it's difficult.
I had to be me, right?
Yeah, I'm glad that you did. I'm glad that you did because this was not a problem before. You were using public space, open source tools, and while licensing is clearly specified, there is pretty much free, right?
Yeah.
What this is, though, is a significant investment. Without getting into too much detail, it's clearly in the range of hundreds of thousands of dollars invested in this, and that came out from Canadian taxpayers' money, right? So for us to just go out there and say, oh, by the way, go ahead and just use it, knock yourself out, it's not that simple, especially since we're paying annual fees to HL7 for our members to have access to their standards. So there could be potential there for a partnership that's more beneficial to both sides, where we can bring some value-added tools to the table, but maybe we can get some benefits for our members. So, because it is in everybody's interest that a standard takes off, right? And how better than giving them value-added tools that they don't have to invest in, which will speed up the process, right?
Okay.
At the same time, you also have to realize, just like my opening remark, that this thing is a consensus-building exercise, not a technical problem. So the moment you open up, they may have now liability issues may come up, because the more people start adopting something, the more they now have a desire to control where that change is going, right? So how will that work? What governance structure is necessary for that? That's still an unknown. One of the SDOs that we're actively involved in is IHT SDO. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with it. It's the Snowman City crowd. They had a tool, not similar at all to Remixer, but conceptually very similar, the Workbench. It was doing the job for themselves while they were just playing with it internally, but then they got overly excited and opened it to the world, and it was a complete failure. The tool was never designed to handle crowds of that magnitude or to integrate properly with the request for change process. And so the moment they started charging the international community high fees for access to it, they realized that, okay, so those communities now have some rightful requests for support, and that's where it falls down, right? So that story is still unfolding. I don't think that our executive management at Infoway has given thought to this yet. This project is pretty much homegrown, and it reached John Burns' level, which is senior executive, but it has not reached, I think, awareness within Infoway management as in, wait a second, we have a potential here to lead the world, really, not just the Pan-Canadian standards implementation efforts, right? So until that realization is there and we are prepared to publicly speak to it, I will still keep this momentum going within HL7 international work groups. As I said, 2-3 times a year I visit them, and so I've been talking to Jane Curry, who's the co-chair of tooling, about some of these items. So yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting.
Sorry for asking the hard
Technically
question.
possible.
Technically possible, but
Like we can, like the process.
Well, if you can do it for jurisdictions like in Canada, I know it's technically possible, but it's the
even here in Canada, believe it or not, legislation is not there to empower you to work with them.
Oh,
As in,
okay.
jurisdictions have pretty much the right to do whatever they want. All they need to do in order to get the investment project money is to show that they are also contributing and that they're meeting their milestones. But how they do it, it's not in your power to control. So, and it's even worse at local levels.
And then we get from jurisdiction down to the health region level, things get more complicated again. Yeah.
So yeah, Australia, for example, I remember when we went to the ISO International meeting in Vancouver last year, Australia had a very nice presentation where they got a mandate from their government to do a very aggressive implementation project for one side of the health IT space. They had only 16 months, which is very short for something of that magnitude. And they made it very clear that unless by the end of the term, when we're done technically speaking, legislation is there to help us, this will fail. And believe it or not, the law was voted on the eve of the standards going live, of the systems going live. It was already implemented systems. Because without political support, there's very hard to incent vendors to make change. Unless they see the profits right there, they will not make change. And it's very hard to argue in the beginning that including standards into your products will give you profit. In the long term, it does, because you become interoperable in other places. But that's a very hard sell to CEOs that are just watching the bottom line, right? So you need legislation to move them forward, which the meaningful use, for example, in US is.
Which leads to an interesting point about the tooling that I'm about to talk to. Message Remixer Message Builder was actually used by an EMR vendor in the United States on the Pan-Canadian standard to qualify for meaningful use in the United States. So the meaningful use standard for EMR in the United States basically say that it has to support an HL7 standard. It didn't say specific versions or anything like that. And the vendor had seen a presentation we give on Message Builder, picked the package, downloaded it, integrated it with their platform, built a full testing suite, and they're able to communicate every single Pan-Canadian message for lab, drug, and they went through meaningful use and demonstrated that they integrate with a standard. There were repositories out there that implemented those interfaces as is, and they got certification for it under meaningful use, which was kind of a shock to us because we released Message Builder and things like that as a open source package that anyone can download. It's not actually jurisdictionally and regionally based to just Canada. If somebody wanted to pick up the package, they can pick it up and use it pretty much anywhere that you can download it from the internet. We track the downloads. There's been a lot of international downloads for it, so we're pretty sure it's being used in different products around the world to do things just like that. And that vendor actually came to us to demonstrate what they had done, and because they were very thankful for actually having that full implementation of an HL7 standard to get through that process.
Sometimes I could not believe it coming from the vendor space where you're pretty much aware of everything you do because you have to show a profit at the end of the day, right? That we in Canada may not know what the other guy is doing in the next room. So there's so much re-implementation going on. There's so much change just because the message doesn't get out. Like literally, the message doesn't get out to reuse components that are available and you could save money. So that was mine. I'll turn over to Greg. I'm not sure how we're doing with time.
Oh, we're good, we're good. It's new, so we,
You can
food
bleed
is
a bit?
coming at 1. Awesome.
Okay, good.
So,
Good.
that should give you enough time, I hope.
Yeah. Well, I'll bleed a bit. I'm actually going to dive in. I have a presentation, but it's kind of a boring way to show the stuff. I've done it as a backup. But I'm going to be speaking specifically to two very specific tools, which is Message Remixer and Message Builder API, which some of the folks in here are very intimately involved with and familiar with, and Mohawk happens to be our testing advisors for all of this stuff to keep us honest and make sure the stuff works, and done a great job doing that. So my background in standards is in mechanical standards and in electronic engineering standards. So NIST, NAVLAP, A2LA, ISO, and FDA GMP. I used to work in the calibration industry for space junk. So standards and measurements and things like that are something in my background. I still hold and maintain some of the certifications for audit in those fields in practice. Although not applicable necessarily at Infoway, I still maintain them. So also my background is in software engineering. Everything I'm going to speak to is from a software engineer's perspective of I actually have to use the standard. I think that was one of the big things that when we were looking at the process, and Attila presented it kind of a different way, we come to this last point here, which is developers, right? And the developers are the ultimate target to using a standard. And as Attila had spoken to, if you look at this large zip file full of thousands of documents and different technical artifacts, developers were like throwing their hands up and going, there's some challenges. We have some problems with, being able to do that. There's, no common implementation methodology. And when I talk about implementation methodology, I'm talking specifically to software engineers sitting down at a keyboard and actually making these messages marshal, unmarshal, and communicating. I'm not talking about the process of developing a standard, because when I pick up the work, it's at here's the standard perspective, and then I build tooling around that to actually be able to use the standard. So again, specifically talking to those two elements of tooling, and again, I highlighted software developer, and I think that's a major element to the marketplace for adoption. Unless you can publish all the standards you want, they can be as detailed and as grand as you want, but if a software developer can't pick it up and use it, the standard may never see the light of day. We can say you have to use this standard, but if we look at our most successful standards out there in the technology space, like HTTP, because they're logical, simple to use, people got it, and developers liked it, and they became the standards after use. Most of our major standards actually happened after someone had developed software for them. So, if you look at it from a consumption, from a developer's perspective, we're looking at 300 potentially different interactions. We're talking about a model with 16,000 objects that compose it in some points. It's a lot to know as a developer. In fact, most software engineers, when asked to integrate to anything using the HL7v3 space, they're not going to go and memorize 16,000 objects in that whole model. In fact, they're probably given 2 months to integrate and do e-prescribing. And that was the case as we saw as the EMR vendors were being told to integrate to the Saskatchewan pharmacy implementation platform. So there's a lot of stuff that we can't expect a software engineer to do, which is memorize a giant model, understand every little detail. So when we looked at it from the perspective of what is the software engineer dealing with, this is what an actual serialized message looks like to find somebody. I'm just basically asking to find Cyril Mullins. Now it's on 2 pages. We have transmission wrappers, control active end wrappers, a payload. There's a lot of stuff to a message just to insert 2 values. Someone's first name and their last name so that we can get back their address from the system. So continuing on the 2nd page, you can see all of this stuff, and you can look and try and find, who I'm looking for, Cyril Mullins. But this all actually has to be there. You can't, and a lot of the software engineers coming from different spaces are like, I don't want all this data. All I just want to do is send you a simple web service that says, I want the address for Cyril, for Cyril Lambert. And we have to say, well, no, there's reason and value for all this other information. And we spoke to that earlier. But for a developer, think about it from a software infrastructure perspective. I have to write software that not only formats and provides all this data, understands it, can validate it, look at it, and then deal with the changes to the model, because what we're dealing with is a messaging system that's based on a model. It's not just a flat message. It's not, your standard Google Web Service message where you're going to process a transaction for payment and it's always the same credit card number value, credit card number value. There's a whole bunch of dynamic data. And these messages and the response messages can change on elements of data, so it's very dynamic in nature. And it's not statically defined. It's a very complex set of rules that are defined in the message interchange format for actually being able to marshal and unmarshal the messages. So this is what we were getting from the software engineers in Canada. I'm a little bit upset. And to be honest, they were a lot upset. When you look at it from a perspective of an electronic medical records vendor, and these are the guys that make the systems in doctor offices to use, they have a development team sometimes of 5 people. Not one of those 5 people is an expert in HL7v3, And if you told their management team that one of them has to become an expert in HL7B3, they would say, what's my ROI? So, you know, it's common things that I hear from the developers. Why is it so complex? Well, you know, the domain itself is complex. Why can't I just have a web service? If you take the XSDs that are generated out of the standard and try and make a web service to it, it is deadly complex. Now we have these different data types which we spoke to. Why can't I just do a basic tombstone? Why do I need a data type for address? What's vocabulary? That literally is an area of the standard which many people struggle with and fail at when implementing the standard. Being able to understand that that is a clinical value, it has meaning, and it has to be, you know, repeatable, and it has to reflect the meaning that at the time of recording it. And vocabulary is something that I find a lot of people don't understand, but is probably the most valuable element to the standard. And why does it take 2 slides of text to find Cyril Lambert in a client registry when I'm just looking for that little basic piece of data, right? And if you look at it from a SWIFT or any other standard in the financial industry, all their messages are typed small. They have some basic information. I'm looking for Greg's bank account. I want to do a transaction with Greg. Here's Greg's account number. They don't have these massive header pieces to them. And that's not even considering the web service infrastructure that wraps around that message or the RESTful interfaces to be able to do that. So we had to come to some realizations if we wanted small doctor office systems to actually be able to integrate and do an e-prescribe. You know, they're small shops. They're not advanced users. You won't find these developers coming to the SWIG meetings and things like that. They're busy building software for a specific, very vertical usage and market, and then we come to them and say, well, you have to be able to prescribe medications electronically to this massive standard. So we had to find something in some way to help them get over that curve, right? And so if you look at a J curve, yeah, we can do that standard. They get to the bottom, and if you can't get them out of the bottom of the J curve, they're not going to be successful, and we won't have e-prescribing. Although we have a large registry and implementation of a DIS platform, they just won't get over that hump, and then we won't have it. And so we had high expectations that everyone would just lovingly embrace the standard and learn everything they can about it. But when we looked at the organizational size of the people actually implementing this, we need to find kind of a different way to do it. So we started to create tooling to actually help them with that. And as Attila mentioned, that tooling actually grew out of an investment program to help those EMR vendors be able to connect to all these different systems, but has grown, as he presented, to a lot more than that. So that takes us to the first tool. We identified quickly in the program that no 2 jurisdictions were alike. And so we had to build tooling actually to be able to manage those differences on the Pan-Canadian standard. So, you know, we often refer to it as the Pan-Canadian standard. You know, controversial way to look at it is the Pan-Canadian reference model, right? And that's a starting ground for the jurisdictions. They may have legislative differences that don't allow them to follow that which is defined. They may have to change something that's mandatory to just required because legislation, or they may have to take something that's required to make it mandatory that you provide that data because their legislation specifically says something that requires it. But we didn't have a way to do that other than the legacy HL7B3 tooling. But we noticed that, you know, people had made these conformance changes, but we needed a kind of a process to be able to capture them, manage them, and make a good life cycle out of it so that we could actually use that knowledge to drive software that they could bring into their products and solutions. So, not articulated in any of the presentation or anything like that is we decided that we were going to canonicalize the entire Pan-Canadian standard into a single file, which I actually have a copy of here to give you kind of an example. It is a large single instance of the HL7B3 standard. I'll give it a second to load it up. It's about 8 megs. It roughly folds 16,000 objects into a single canonical model. And from this canonical model, I can reproduce the original sets of myth that it was generated from. So our input is myth, our output will always be myth, and we track the changes.
Which version?
2.1.3. So we can read myth 1 and 2.1.3, and our output is 2.1.3, which is the pan-Canadian standards are published in. We could support, and we could change outputters as the Standards Collaborative for 2.1.6, which would be ideal, but right now it's 2.1.3. So we have a very strict adherence to myth as the standard for describing it. Any documentation should be able to be generated from myth. Any API should be able to be generated from myth. And we quickly were able to actually demonstrate that that could be done. If you look at it from a large perspective, every single piece of data element is all represented within a single file. We did that so that we could actually have a tool sit on top of it versus managing thousands of files and thousands of relationships across 16,000 different objects. We also built compression rules to actually reduce the model. So we've taken it from 16,000 to about 8,000 objects at times, because there's a lot of repetition in high reuse data models. So everything for the basis of tooling is based on this canonical message set. And then we actually allow you to apply deltas. And I'll actually go in and provide some deltas. No, I didn't download it. But we can actually go into the tooling and actually apply some deltas to get kind of an idea of how it's done. So I'll actually go into production. And I'll actually show you some examples of them.
Probably a ridiculous question.
Bad gateway?
So the file that you just showed us is already collapsed. I assume when you reproduce the myths, you uncollapse.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And we the same algorithm coming in would kind of like think of it like zipping.
Mm-hmm.
We unzip it back out to the big, and in Remixer it's actually aware of all the collapsing and all the model requirements, and it actually enforces model when you're actually doing so.
So if I'm, for example, if you collapse a person CMAT, and I edit that in the Remixer, and that collapsed CMAT was from 5 different patient CMATs. When you expand it, is that change reflected in all 5, or just in the one I intended? Does it just go to the, like, if I just want to edit one of those CMATs?
If you're editing a core CMAT that's reused, and you change that CMAT, it will everybody who has a relationship to that will get the update.
What if it's just like a message type then? If it's a collapsed message type, would it?
Yep, we can collapse message type.
So for example, if I'm editing the observation, an observation.
Well, let's look at one specifically.
All right.
MR 2009.
Sure. So if we're going down a rabbit hole, just
no. It's actually
pull me
not,
out.
it's actually a pretty good rabbit hole to go down because it actually touches to the actual tool specifically. I'm looking for it here. This is a 2009. Oh no, that's CREP. Sorry. Just can't see. So specific interaction or CMAT.
Yeah. So for example, if I go into what's this one? A PR.
Yeah, this is a PR.
Okay. So if I go in and edit in my transmission wrapper, I need to have an extra piece of data about the serial number on one of the senders. Would that then, if that's a collapsed message type, or if it's been optimized, and I only want it on one interaction, does it then?
It reflects.
It'll propagate out.
It propagates properly.
Okay.
But you would never actually see that. Like when you look at it from a perspective within Remixer, you only see the expanded model.
Oh, you
Right.
only see the expanded model.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
You
those
don't
aren't,
see it collapsed.
okay, those aren't the collapse. Okay.
It's collapsed for purposes of technical reasons,
Okay.
being able to manage that much data. But when you look at it from a perspective of in Remixer, you'd never really know that it's actually collapsed in the background. Because Remixer is aware of that. So when I'm expanding any of these trees or anything like that, it's applying those rules.
You see, that's one of the quality control side effects of using the model this way. Because if you're changing exactly for your use case, your intent is you're changing a CMAP. Your intent is to reflect properly everywhere, right? So it does it automatically.
Okay. I was just whenever I hear about collapsing or optimization, where you say, oh, these two classes are the same, so internally I'm going to represent them as one, and then when you edit that one, then it would propagate out to two instead of just editing one originally.
Yeah.
Right. But if you're taking care of that, then that's very cool.
Yeah, and we're actually testing for it. And one of the interesting things that always gets asked of us is, does it work? And I'm like, when we have production software with these APIs integrated in 3 vendors that are actually prescribing live medications, and they've gone through conformance testing and are running and doing e-prescribe in Saskatchewan, and they're actually prescribing medications, which is actually a pretty serious message interaction. And those vendors were successful in their implementation in 2 months. They recently spoke at partnership and provided a perspective. If they did not have the tooling available to them, they wouldn't be able to give an estimate if they would ever even been able to do the work from scratch. So it's you know, the proof for me from a software engineering perspective is, does it work? Well, it works when people use it, and then you get the feedback on it. So the collapsing is more for repetitive elements of the model. But like if you go into the model in detail, you will see those repetitives. Like I can open and expand these trees to the 14th layer of normalization, which this model can actually get to at points. Like if you were talking about it as a normalized model, you can have something contained in something that is contained in something that is contained in something that references something. So you might have to go 14 layers deep as a developer to actually get to the place where you actually want to put the piece of data that you need to put it in. So there's a lot of wrapper structure to this standard. It's quite large from that perspective. So if you look at it from a jurisdiction's perspective, I will kind of give you a perspective of a large change one. Saskatchewan Pharmacy Implementation Platform. And this is actually in production software that people are using. So if I just look at the delta set changes that come up, there's quite a few, right? If we list them all, I'm actually going to sort them by the type of change, because we allow for a bunch of different types of changes. If you look at it, this is everything that they changed from the Pan-Canadian standard, right? So there's 995 changes from the published version of the Pan-Canadian standard. Now, you notice that as I was scrolling, there's lots of documentation. These are annotational changes, where they just describe how you use it differently. Not necessarily structural change to the standard, but how you use it. And if you keep looking at, I'm still in documentation, oh, definitional changes. So if you look at it proportionally, they're not actually making major changes to the definitionals, you know, changing things from, you know, associations or changing conformance types or really making major changes. There's lots of document changes, like use this vocabulary here, don't use that vocabulary there. The nice thing is when we generate the APIs, all of that documented change and everything gets integrated into the Java doc and the .NET documentation that they use. So at the fingertips of the developer, they mouse over just like you would with any other API. It says, boom, if you're populating this, here's some information you need to know that's specific to that element that you're about to populate. And that was kind of the biggest thank you from the developers that we've received, is that they don't have to leave their development environment to seek out massive volumes of text and documents. And if you print out you know, the standards and all that, we're talking about thousands of pages. And developers were like, I need to instantiate and create the specific message. So if we look at it from the Delta perspectives, right, I can go in and just take a look at this change. So we do offer some features, functions for change. They're limited, and you can see all the documented changes, right? And these are all definitions right out of the Pan-Canadian standard. If you don't like it, you can change it. And it'll mark that as a Delta change. And what's neat is that we now know you changed that. And we've stored a history of that change. And we can then compare your sets of changes with other jurisdictions' changes. And then we can see how close you match, even at your documentation level. And it's amazing because we have 2 major pharmacy systems now remixed, that a lot of them are actually changing the same thing and saying the same stuff. Which comes to the next point to Attila's perspective is, okay, well, if jurisdiction A and B changed it, and they're the 2 first implementers, maybe the Pan-Canadian standard should reflect that change. And maybe they shouldn't have to jurisdictionally manage that change individually for their jurisdiction. It should probably be promoted up and be considered. But until we capture all of that data of the standard, it's hard to have that conversation, right? Because you kind of need the evidence to support the fact that, and then what happens, you have each individual jurisdiction might be proposing to a SWIG the exact same thing, just worded slightly different, but when you see it implemented specifically to the standard, it really makes it easy to communicate. So one of the things that we're actually bringing forward and was the biggest thing that people asked for was visualization of the models. So as you saw in the previous stuff that we were talking about earlier in the day, you know, there's a lot of dependency on how we visualize that. And I make it very clear, everything that is needed to do anything with HL7v3 is described in MIF. There's a lot of people that will tell you, no, you can't use MIF, you can't do that with MIF, but we've successfully generated APIs. We now generate full visual models on the data contained within the MIFs. And I have a couple of screenshots of those. But I'll just quickly go through. The first version that we created for Message Remixer was to basically do basic conformance changes, optional, mandatory, just because we needed something that could modify the message set so that we could produce an API that would marshal and unmarshal messages properly. People actually liked the tool so much that they said, you know, we should make some major changes to it, so we went through a total rewrite of the user interface and built a whole bunch of new functionality to do that. And now we're embarking on version 3.0, which is going to have full visualization of the models. And it's all derived right from MIF. And it's not from the Visio diagrams that are contained in MIF. It's actually from the model data that's described in MIF. So we're going to have comparison tooling to say, well, this was my input MIF, this is my output MIF. Comparison tooling to compare the UV domain to the Pan-Canadian domain to look for changes. And be able to manage those changes and kind of publish them differently. And then we're going to actually have a bunch more self-service feature and function. So just to give everyone kind of a perspective on it, this was actually generated from Remixer. So we basically are able to present a visual walkthrough model now within Remixer. So you'll be able to action on. And if you click specifically elements, you'll be able to edit them. You'll be able actually to dive into this CMET by clicking on it. It'll take you to context and view of that. It's all done with scalable vector graphics. And when you're in context, and I actually have some screenshots. When you're in context, so if I'm in context to receiver, you'll notice that receiver's got a nice darker black box around it. And you can actually walk the model visually and get to pretty much any element you want to. And this was kind of to support the next generation of use, which is to support the standards collaborative use of this to actually do the Pan-Canadian standard releases. So, you know, as you can see, I've been a responsible party, and then you can see actually some of the details of it, mandatory, populated the data. And
we have changed slightly the layouts of the diagrams because they have to be auto-generated. The past Visio layouts were basically human laid out, so they were trying to compress screen space. But we took a more layered approach, which is better shown by actually loading up the full model picture, where we sorry, I'm on an angle here. Where we're actually starting with your entry point to your main element, and then each layer is lined up uniquely to the next layer. And we actually build the picture backwards from the deepest part of the model in order to do that. And we actually have an algorithm for sorting and managing the screen space as best we can to do that. And I believe I saw Firefox on the desktop. And I can actually open up the an SVG to actually show you in the large what the new layouts look like. So you notice like some of the changes are like the annotations are actually contained within the box. They're not floating off in the distance with a line drawn to them.
Don't
They're actually
forget
contained.
that these things are running in a browser. You no longer need Visio for it.
Right.
I mean, you can use any browser, new generation browser, HTML5 enabled, and they also have the advantage that they can be generated with those plugins. So I don't need to release this. I can just release the MIF. You generate this whenever you need it. You make a change to the model, you can regenerate it to reflect the change you made.
Yeah, and actually these changes, so if I go, some of the edit screens I was showing you, if I make a change, it will reflect immediately. So this model, which is quite large, takes 58 milliseconds to generate. It can be updated on the fly. So if I go into Remixer and I remove elements, like a relationship, it will show up upon committing of the save of that change. It'll show you your deltas. It'll actually show you, we're hoping to be able to build overlays so that it'll like slash out the changes from the Pan-Canadian standard to actually visually identify the differences that you're applying. Because we do some visual identification within the current version of Remixer when you're applying a change. So you'll see here somebody made a change, conformance change to this element, so it's highlighted black, right? So as you're browsing it, and one of the first things that we did was we structured the layouts and the tree views and the navigation to be very much tuned to what a software developer is used to seeing in an IDE. When they see it, they see that this is contained within this, within that. So it can break out the full tree views, which was a very challenging element to develop and to make actually perform quite quick. So we're going to be able to actually show some of the differentiating elements visually as well. So you can look at, and I took these screenshots from the Saskatchewan PIP, so you can see where they've applied all of their conformance changes in this element, in this message part. And again, in perspective, when you're now looking at the actual relationship, you'll have a nice little tab that has the visuals. You can click over to the visual, and this will be actually represented and highlighted to the actual point you're at the edit on. And we're actually planning on having the edit screens be the bottom and having the visual image up top so that you can actually navigate. So when you click something, it brings the edit screen below. You won't be able to do visual editing like you can in like a Visio to drag lines and draw these relationships in Visio. You'll orchestrate all the change through UI, user interface inputs, right?
How do you manage demons? How do you manage demons?
Demons? Like specifically like manage them.
Well, I mean, so if you're going to try to generate the RMINs, the serializable models, which are all traced back and coordinated with a daemon, the main model that's not related to
Oh,
each other.
yeah.
Right?
Yeah, we basically provide that what you see in RMIN Designer. So it's specifically to the messaging models.
Yes, but you then create
RMIN Designer supports email.
Yeah, but we only support messaging, right? So anything that, and it's specific to the Pan-Canadian standard.
So you only support serializable models.
Right,
Okay, right.
right.
It's not a full editing suite. I mean,
No,
It's
just,
specific to the Pan-Canadian messaging standard and serializable messages. So everything is looked at from the perspective of the serialized version. So we pick up the MIFs, generate the message set from MIF, and then from there, apply conformance changes to
There
that.
are, of course, myths of demons as well, but they're not serializable.
Right, right. And so we only look at it from the perspective of that which can be serialized into a message.
Okay.
Right? So so we start off where V3 generator kind of hands us the final messages. If you wanted to make massive model changes, you'd have to go through and make changes to the daemon and things like that. You'd have to do it in that environment, generate the myth, and then we can bring it out. But we only are applying conformance changes to specifically the Pan-Canadian standard.
So it's almost like we're drawing the line in the sand, creating a baseline with what we have right now, and then from here on, because you have already this much information, you can easily go on further. You wouldn't have been able to reach here with this tool, but now that you have it, it's easier to go on.
Yeah, like I couldn't take we have to start with serializable.
So which implies that, from the Pan-Canadian point of view, we'd always be starting with a UV model. We wouldn't ever decide that we have a need in a domain that we want to explore that UV hasn't done yet. Because the methodology would require that that work has already been done.
Exactly. So
Okay.
Which is,
this-
it's choice in terms of limitation, but it's a
It is.
limitation.
It is. It doesn't do, definitely doesn't do the 100%. It's just like fire.
Yeah.
We focus on the
Yeah.
80 most frequent one, and then
well,
Yeah,
it's
we'll come up
it's
with-
based on the Canadian needs,
Yeah.
which is your Canadian taxpayers are paying for the development of Canadian tools. It's kind of hard to justify why you would be, saying, but this works well for the Australians. I
Yeah.
understand that.
Like if someone were to come with us with a completed message set where they've gone through the same process as Canada has for publication to a final myth of like all our domains, I can pick up those and bring them into Remixer. I'm not going to say I can't, because I've taken other jurisdictions' publications and brought them in, and I've gone through process of applying them, but they have to be very concrete implementations. And the Pan-Canadian Center is a very concrete implementation. Like a lot was invested in actually getting and arriving, because the UV is, it may sound wrong, but it's incomplete by nature.
I was going to say by nature, by design,
Yeah, it's by nature.
And
Because
Not
you-
so much incomplete, it's less rigorous.
That's actually
That
better.
sounds
I
like I'm picking, a hair.
No, but I actually
but
like it.
it's intentionally less rigorous because it's meant to serve a wide variety.
Yeah, like you can't serve every audience
I actually
in it.
wouldn't even use the word rigorous. It's actually just less
Constrained.
constraints, more optional, right? Because
But-
in the US they use RxNR, we use DIM, right? As just or whatever, right?
Yeah.
There's lots of things you can't prescribe on an international level.
Exactly, and like this whole tool was, this tooling was built on the understanding that even though we went through that process to make a Pan-Canadian standard, we couldn't even get to the level of prescribing to the jurisdictions, and then in there, the jurisdictions applied additional conformance changes. So we had to provide tooling to support that. So again, we can support all sorts of changes to constraints, anything in MIF. Not every element of MIF is allowable to be edited yet, but as a jurisdiction needs that functionality, we'll add it. We're doing that to kind of contain the flexibility, so there's kind of a balance of, should we let them do it? Or should they be coming to the Standards Collaborative and to the SWIGs to say, we want to do this, I can't do it in the tooling. Okay, well, it's kind of a governance point for us. And one of the things that we've gotten some positive and negative feedback on is now we have full perspective as to what they did in their implementation, which means we could govern what they did and say, you're not allowed to do that, you're allowed to do this. Right now, jurisdictions have been developing pretty much outside the scope, and if they do have somebody that contributes back to the standard, so be it, but we have small jurisdictions that are no bigger than the city of Hamilton, right, that are building software. So it's hard for everybody to contribute equally. So talking to the self-service model, we can actually now self-service, the download of a bunch of different things. And one of the interesting things here is to actually be able to download your MIFs. And this actually generates MIF 2.1.3 without any assistance from V3 generator. So I can actually, sorry, generate, if I want to here on the fly, with this delta set for Saskatchewan PIP. I can actually go to reports, to files, and say I want my MIF. Will it let me save it to desktop, or do I have to put it on my key?
In downloads, it should be fine.
In downloads?
Yeah. It should be fine. There. Okay.
Well, that one didn't work.
Yeah, you're inside the zip folder right now.
Am I inside of it?
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. So you'll see I've got all my messages. I'm not used to looking at CRX. I always look at number 2009. But you'll see that I've got all the model assets. So you can see
Notepad.
is there a WordPad here? There we go. That's WordPad. And so we actually generated the MIF. And we're going through the process of testing to make sure all the elements of MIF are there from the beginning to the end. And this is kind of interesting because from this MIF, you could actually take it and technically put it through the V3 generation process and generate documentation and a variety of different things. We've tested it to do some elements like that to be able to generate like word views and that. But in the new version of Remix, we're actually going to generate an HTML output that's similar to WordView, and we're going to actually be able to apply different templates to give a technical view as well that provides different formats. That way the jurisdiction can download, or whoever it is, download their own copy of it, put it on their own website. We could publish it on Info Central for them if they'd like, or they can manage their assets themselves. And then again, they can regenerate their assets at any time they want them, and just keep getting them.
So you can imagine now, in the not so distant future, when the Swigs sit down and they work on an item that they want to discuss, they can open up the visualizer there, look at the original message, how they want to change it. They reach consensus right there inside of the meeting, and they generate the artifacts. And they can attach that artifact, that MIF that they created, potentially to a request for change to the standards collaborative. We look at it. And then
We could even go so far as if they wanted to make a performance change, they could go in, create a delta, and then add the delta set, because we track all the change. There's a change log that actually is tracked that's used to blend the old standard and produce the new standard. So we take the delta set and say, this is my delta change. This is exactly what I want. All annotations, all conformance changes, and all elements, even to more complex levels of model changes. And so there's no ambiguity in a generic statement. The RFC is explicit. We all came to the agreement that it's this. And then we can actually take it technically and reproduce it. So the job of the standards collaborative and for Attila's team is basically just processing that which has been provided to be done. And in fact, you could self-serve it if you wanted. You just say, all of these deltas have been approved, create my final message set, publish. And hit the publish button and you're done. So we actually have some vocabulary features specific to messaging. So it's not a vocabulary management platform like you would get for actually managing vocabularies. The vocabulary that we do is specific to vocabulary usage in messaging. So we actually do checks now to say, if you're trying to change a vocabulary domain, like we say for drug, you should use SNOMED CT, and no jurisdiction does. They use FDB or they use DIN for fill. So we actually have to have allowable for that change. So we are able to actually manage the messaging's relationship to vocabulary. So if I were to go in and try and change a vocabulary in a message and say, type Greg is awesome as the vocabulary, it actually does a validation check and says, I'm sorry, you can't do that, Greg. You can't change it in that message context to that vocabulary. Because it checks, because we actually load the vocabulary MIFs in. You'll see for the complex vocabularies, they're kind of highlighted out because they're complex formulaics that actually generate those vocabularies. And we haven't really found a good way to actually provide a way to edit those formulas in a web-based environment. So we're pretty much only allowing the basic ones.
So the extensional values that are here cannot be intentional ones.
Yeah. And that's because they can be, because we're just trying to figure out some way of being able to lay out that and then and organize it. So if I wanted to, I can add a concept if I wanted. And then when I actually go to the self-service stuff on my, I can actually generate the vocabulary.
So the maintenance we're doing today in the MTW, how does that come back into this process?
We're hoping to be able to bring it in one day as bring in the functionality in the master terminology worksheet and provide functionality for that in the context of this tooling, but we're not close yet.
Yeah, because of course right now for some of those licenses, this week they're going to be doing reviews and
Oh, yeah.
updating, right?
Right. Just so you know,
Yeah.
I am just starting, as in literally last week, we worked on the first version of the project charter for building the terminology blueprint within OOC. It's going to look at all the product offerings of the team and what's the inputs and outputs. And then once that's clearly defined, we'll see how does it integrate with the rest of the tooling. So the future may integrate terminology on this a lot better. Right now we're relying on whatever methods they have to generate the vocab names.
Yeah.
We just suck them in.
Yeah, we just suck them in as they're defined. I've actually tracked, we store in the database every element that's in that, but I don't allow you to edit certain specific features because those are complex features that we just haven't gotten to developing yet. They're on slate, we'd like to do them. Obviously, Wendy would jump for joy if we did. It's a matter of managing priority to the tooling, to the resulting work. So I think one of the core concepts of Message Remixer is that myth is the representation of the standard. You know, if we look at it from what we're publishing and what everyone should be able to rely on 100% all the time, it should be myth. And that's kind of the development methodology we did for remixing. You know, everything you need, the truth is in myth. That describes the standard. Myth in, myth out. We want to be able to take in myth, make a bunch of changes to our canonical model, but it has to be able to come out in myth and be supported in myth and be compliant to the myth standard. So again, restating, everything coming in should produce 100% clear, clean, pure myth. And we've been very adamant about that because a lot of our jurisdictional partners don't maintain myth, and that's kind of been a challenge because maybe they don't understand the tooling that was originally used to generate myth and RMIM and D3 generator because they are large, complex tools to deal with. And the quote Master Yoda, fear of myth leads to anger. Anger over mismanaged standards leads to hate of the standard. Hate leads to suffering and excess Ds. Which is one of the things that all of our software vendors on the EMR side, when we hand them the XSDs, they go, thank you. These are completely and utterly uninterpretable to us. We can't use them. They're like, sure, it gives us some structural stuff, but I put this coded value in here, and then the thing told me that I'm not allowed to put that data there. Can you give me the definition that tells me what I'm supposed to put there? And that's where kind of the next thing I'm going to talk to, which is the really cool stuff, is Message Builder. And Message Builder was kind of a realization that the developers in a certain market space, and I'm not talking in terms of registries and big EHR implementations, I'm talking about pharmacy vendors and EMR vendors, and a lot of the software companies you'll actually end up going to work for, don't really understand the standard, don't know it. And although we'd love for them to all invest thousands of hours to learn that model, you know, the return on investment was there. So we actually built tooling to actually help them with that. And it was quickly identified through past work that I had done and other members of my team that we needed some sort of API. Now, we didn't build this API to be competitive to our friends at Mohawk or to replace their existing API. And, you know, it was kind of, we needed to support two platforms, Java, .NET, all that kind of stuff. And Mohawk's our testing partner for all of the APIs. So, you know, there's the concept of message builder, and it takes the MIFs, creates a canonical model, and that actual model that I had brought up, that big giant XML document, it's actually contained in the API. So when the API needs to marshal something, it actually asks the model, how do I marshal this? Am I allowed to put this there? What's the rules that I'm supposed to be, to actually build that giant 2-page slide that I had originally shown? So, you know, we feel it's a full-blown ITS in that it does structural and semantic validation. It's not just a structural rule set that's trapped in the text file. We have .NET and Java implementation, so we think we've got a pretty good coverage base of what most software development platforms out there. We'd like to have a Ruby version of it as well, potentially in the future. And we do runtime governance checking within the core element of the API. So at runtime we can marshal, and if you're a developer trying to populate one of these messages, you don't populate it all, it will say, I am not sending that. You do not conform to the Pan-Canadian standard, and will give a specific set of things that you're missing, and the direct path to those missing elements. So we kind of feel it's one of a kind in the market. There might be more. There's actually Mark High that has an API. We think it's one of a kind because it supports Java and .NET.
We're supporting Java 2 now. We just released it.
When are you guys supporting Java?
It's on our SVM.
When did you release that?
3 weeks ago.
3 weeks ago? Well, that's why I haven't heard about it yet.
It's okay. It's mostly UV stuff that we do now.
I'll edit the slide right
We just handle the UV stuff now because we
Yeah.
know message builder.
because of message builder.
Well, you guys are more focused on
the
pay stuff, so you can do a better job at it. So we help the core universal folks.
Yeah, and you help us test it and keep us honest about it all. So we wanted to do that. So we, you know, I speak to truth when I say that there are vendors out there using this. Optimed Software has it embedded in their software platform. They are using it to send pharmacy messages. Wolf Medical has the .NET platform, and they're communicating with the Alberta Client Registry. They have production software in doctors' offices doing this work, and they're actively involved with us going through these processes. And we have other vendors that are now coming on board. A statement of work was signed, it's public knowledge now. Optimed requires Ontario, eHealth Ontario, to publish a message builder API for them to continue to use for the future medication management platform, as well as as a couple other vendors. So the vendors have actually been our biggest proponents, not our jurisdictional partners. They tend to not be as fast changing as the software markets. And again, these vendors are driven by results. And they're requesting this, and they're asking for these requirements to be put in statements of works and agreements that they do with the jurisdictions because they know it generates results. So just to kind of give you a perspective, actually I think I can go to this page directly because we're on the net. That's the link on this page. And I don't have to dig for it. Solutions. Sorry, I can't see. Is it down?
Right below jurisdictions.
That's the area. So this is actually running in real time on our server. So I can take a HL73 version of one of our messages. So find candidate's query, the one that I've shown up. So I can go and validate. See how fast it came back? Went through every model performance requirement for that huge message in under a second, which we haven't seen. And it came back and said, wow, your message sucks. And it gives you all the specific elements of what you sucked at. And you can, now, the errors were actually injected into this. I believe this one candidate queries is for one of them, and it should validate the. I used to have a key that told, a little piece of paper that told me, this message works with this one, it won't cause the. It's not validating against any. We put some trick ones in there. I think my demographic is for R03. Yeah. So I can actually go in and just so it's not faked, I can go screw up something. Well, when we were talking about this data type earlier, right? II. In the Pan-Canadian standard, it's required to use BUS. I changed it to Greg. I'm a developer, I have no idea why it needs to be BUS. But my API, before I even sent a message and tied up a HILE and tied up, you know, a drug platform or a client registry, I couldn't even get the message to turn into a text file to even put into a web service to send it down the wire to a HILE. It basically said, no, you can't use Greg. If I change it back to BUS, boom, it validates again. I can mess up vocabularies, I can play with the file and see what my validation rules are. And you can do this in your integrated development environment while you're developing the software. So you can build a test case, populate, try and figure out what you need to put in to actually get the message to go out the door. And when you try to send the message out the door, it gives you a nice little error log like we're seeing on the screen saying, no, you can't do that. And that was incredibly powerful in helping the developers actually be able to create these wonderfully odd messages. And that was kind of the biggest feedback we got from Optimed, was that had they not had something that could tell them real time, don't do that, you have to do this, and guide them through every step, you know, through an iterative process of trying to marshal these messages, that to build the infrastructure just to even do this would have been dangerous and challenging. One of the other vendors, when we proposed that maybe you should use Message Builder, they were like, oh, it's just XML. If I hear that from another vendor, then I'm going to jump out a window. It's not just XML. It's a very complex data model that's represented in XML. And the vendor actually was like boldly like, oh, it's easy. And they started with find candidates, get demographic, which is finding Greg and getting Greg's information. Less than 12 hours later at midnight, we received a panic email from their development team saying, we need to download Message Builder. Did you know that the message structure changes? And we're like, yes. The only way you can actually deal with the message structure is if your API actually knows every potential allowable change that could happen. And if you statically define it in a big giant XSD or something like that, then you have to deal with the full structure and shell and just cross your fingers. Whereas Message Builder can populate against the rule sets that are defined in the standard. And that's, I believe, the next element of testing that we're going to be doing is the
146.net.
146.net is the one that's coming up. And, you know, and so we actually go through a process of testing these APIs across a bunch of different things. And test cases, it's quite extensive actually, the test suite. So we marshal and marshal messages, try to break it, try to violate conformance rules that we know that we're not allowed to violate, and see how the actual platform adapts and changes to it. So speaking to specifically, this is just a very small code snippet. A small code snippet of what it would look like to populate, and the example I have here is Jane Smith with Sierra Lambert. So if you look at those multiple pages, it can be boiled down. There's some header and footer code to this for developing it, but to actually populate Jane Smith, it actually shows you the structure, and it deals with the data types. The data types are there. It deals with the vocabulary. It'll populate the vocabulary. If you point at the right vocabulary, it'll tell you you can't put bloody nose into a condition statement. You actually have to put the actual clinical definition as such.
In your sample message, I'm nitpicking, but you had basically the author, like who's doing the query. How does that get populated in this?
Oh, in this one?
Yeah.
This is just a snippet.
Oh, okay.
This is just a snippet. I wanted to focus it down specifically to populating the person's name, because that's
Okay.
kind of the theory. But you would have to pre-populate, Doctor.
Yeah,
I think it's
just
Dr.
basically
Black.
stuff that would change.
Yeah, there's a
at
whole
runtime.
structure to it. And if you go into the documentation, you can actually find where I stole that from. User guide.
No, I was curious if you're like integrating with the operating system to grab the machine name to throw into the transmission wrapper.
You could if you wanted to.
Yeah.
You just build your framework. One of the nice things about the Java library is it's all annotated.
Mm-hmm.
And one of our vendors, the pharmacy vendors, actually can unplug and plug in any message builder API in, because it's all based on annotations.
Mm-hmm.
So they can take the Saskatchewan, pick one out, drop in Newfoundland's, and they get a pretty good line up to the annotations. And it saves them thousands, potentially millions of dollars to do that. We're also integrating it deeply into, for experimentation purposes, into MuleSoft's messaging service bus. So the validator will actually be a service engine to Mule. Marshall and Marshall will be like, if you're thinking in concepts of JVI, binding components and things like that. So and we've actually successfully, and this is why I find it interesting when you made a comment about BizTalk, we can take the Java runtimes for Message Builder and drop them into MuleSoft. Their data validator, called the data mapper, picks it up. I can do all the wire mappings I want to V2. And we didn't really do any work to do that. Now, we want them to be able to, when they do a mapping, call the data type validator to actually validate that you can drag this version of AD Basic to that version of AD Basic. But again, that's underlying stuff that we could integrate in that tooling. But it might be just a difference in the technology platforms. They didn't ask for any XSDs in order to be able to read a message. To do that in that platform and we're going to look at WebSphere and a couple others. And I think, do you guys write this documentation too? I know you wrote the documentation for Remixer. I'm not sure if you do it for
I'll have to
Message
Paul for
Builder,
that.
do you?
Where's Paul? Oh, Paul
I'll
disappeared.
let you know.
Wrote on asking questions, huh?
Paul's with.
But if you'll see, like,
Ah, he's with the food.
the new user guide is all web-based, and then I have creating a message. I stole it from here. Why does it keep doing that to me? So you'll see I picked it up. So it goes through the steps, and I just stole step. And that's all the errors in the message.
I'm good at making
There it
those.
is. There's still from step 4, and for some reason it's jumping here. Do you guys do the documentation for Message Builder?
No.
So we actually write it.
I
know you do
if
for
there-
Remixer.
If there's, if there's a user guide and we find something wrong with it, we'll correct it.
You'll correct it, yeah.
Um,
But I know you're the core writers for the
yes,
Remixer.
yeah, we did the remixer guide twice, I believe.
Yeah, yeah. You'll be doing it again shortly.
I saw that, yeah. After this.
So that, and we've provided a bunch of documentation on how to do it. For some reason it keeps jumping me back up. And we're actually starting now to provide code samples that show you how to unmarshal and marshal messages in the pharmacy space. And this has brought us to the point of being able to harmonize some of our standards and start looking at commonizing, making common messages that are reusable within all jurisdictions. And that's pretty much that tooling in a nutshell. If we look at it from our perspective, you see it from a cycle of message remixer to message builder. We actually have a testing platform and testing environment that is built around the message builder API for being able to validate test messages. You can load some sample data into it. And then everything is going to a core publishing point of the wiki from the tooling perspective. If you have questions, feel free to send an email. We're pretty quick to respond.
Or we can tackle you at lunch.
Yeah.
Or we can tackle you at lunch.
Cool.
You stand between them and food. I would like to thank you all very much. What we had on the agenda was that the lunch and so forth would be informal if you wanted to come to people and ask questions. It was also sort of an opportunity for those of us who have planes to catch and so forth to sneak away into the afternoon without ducking out on actual meetings. So, depending on what you have scheduled for afternoon in terms of classes or whatnot, some of the people will be around. I know Lorraine and I will be here till about 2 when our car comes to take us to the airport. I'm not sure how long Attila and Greg were intending to stay, but
If people have questions, I'm more than happy to stick around.
But I'd like to thank you all very much for coming, and I hope you found it useful and enjoyable. And
Well, I'd like to thank you for choosing Wall College. RIMBAA out of cycling. I'm sure the students, I know the students appreciate it. They've learned a lot about HL7 and fire, and as well as V3. And it's very relevant to the products they're doing. Very helpful.
and thanks to Attila and Greg for coming in.
Yes, thank you. Can't help but bring it up.
Good luck, guys.
Well, in that case, let's get going. Hi, everybody. I haven't had a chance to introduce myself yet, so I'll do that just now. I'm Attila Farkas. I'm director with Canada Health Infoway for the Standards Collaborative. Should I turn this on?
Yeah.
There you go. Oh my goodness.
There we go. It's better.
Perfect. So, when Andy sent us an email about a week ago, 2 weeks ago?
Well, 3 weeks.
3 weeks?
3
Oh my
weeks.
God, time
We
flies.
responded a week later.
Exactly. So we were wondering what this meeting was all about. Andy in Hamilton talking at the college is this his thing or is this HR someone? It was not very clear. And then we started exchanging some emails and